What shaped Elizabeth Bennet before she met Mr. Darcy? Discover the untold chapter of her life in this beautifully written, Jane Austen-inspired prequel. In a world where wit is admired but judgment is tested, young Elizabeth faces a lesson that will change her forever. If you love classic stories, strong heroines, and timeless English charm, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more literary tales brought to life. It is a truth universally acknowledged at Longbourn that any gentleman of genteel appearance, unaccompanied by wife or scandal, must be welcome at the table, provided he brings with him conversation sufficient to enliven the drawing room and a surname proper enough to appease Mrs. Bennet's sense of social advantage. Mr. Alexander Price, therefore, arrived under every favorable circumstance. "He is a particular acquaintance of Mr. Phillips," Mrs. Bennet declared, fanning herself as she relayed the news with the air of a general announcing the return of a victorious regiment. "A young man of learning, with family in Oxfordshire, and the most agreeable manners. He has lately taken lodgings in Meryton for the summer, no doubt for the good air. Or the better gossip," muttered Mr. Bennet from behind his newspaper. "Nothing so purifies the lungs as provincial scandal." Elizabeth, seated by the window with a volume of Fielding open but neglected on her lap, smiled to herself. She had learned to weigh her father's sarcasm against the truth and found it generally well balanced. "He is to dine with us tomorrow," continued Mrs. Bennet, "and I expect, Lizzie, that you shall wear the green muslin. It brings color to your cheeks. Not that you are likely to care whether you please or not. He is said to read poetry." This last was delivered with a glance half mocking and half hopeful. Elizabeth, though no stranger to such maternal urgings, could not wholly suppress her curiosity. "A man who reads poetry," she replied, "must be either insufferably sentimental or delightfully insincere. I await the experiment with scientific interest." "You will do no such thing," cried Mrs. Bennet. "You will behave with civility. Though you delight in mischief, Lizzie, I dare say even you cannot tease a guest upon first acquaintance." Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Jane, who only smiled gently and bent again over her embroidery. When the morrow came and Mr. Price arrived at Longbourn, he was declared by all to be everything that had been promised. Of middle height, with a countenance more shrewd than handsome, he possessed that air of easy cleverness which recommends a man quickly to the discerning and the vain alike. His eyes were lively, his speech polished without pretension, and he made no unnecessary display of admiration, which in itself proved refreshing to the Miss Bennets, long used to clumsy compliments from the Meryton officers. "I believe you are fond of novels, Miss Elizabeth," he said after dinner, approaching her where she stood examining a miniature of her uncle Gardiner. "I am fond of sense, sir, and novels are sometimes its best disguise." He laughed, not too loudly, but with enough warmth to suggest real amusement. "Then I may hope to speak without disguise myself, and not be judged a villain?" Elizabeth, intrigued, tilted her head. "A man who speaks without disguise may be either very brave or very foolish. Then let us hope I am both." This reply, so perfectly balanced between boldness and jest, charmed her at once. She resolved to take his measure by conversation rather than report, and in this Mr. Price proved an apt subject. But Jane, ever watchful, said that evening as they walked in the garden, "He is quick certainly, but I wonder if he is also kind." Elizabeth turned to her sister with raised brows. "Is it so rare for a man to be both?" Jane hesitated. "No, only that one must hope wit does not come at the expense of others." Elizabeth laughed lightly, her spirits too animated to entertain doubt. "You are determined to make a philosopher of me, Jane, but I am not yet 17 and have every intention of enjoying my errors." And with that, she skipped ahead, unaware that her next lesson in judgment was already upon her. The following days brought Mr. Price frequently to Longbourn, where he was received with increasing favor. His conversation, marked by a swift and nimble understanding, rarely lingered on common subjects, and when it did, it was only to transfigure them into objects of amusement. He spoke of books, of town fashions, of political pamphlets and absurd sermon titles with equal ease and equal irony, and in Elizabeth he discovered what he termed a mind alert enough to parry, and dangerous enough to wound. "I declare," he said one morning during a visit, as he and Elizabeth walked the shaded lane behind the orchard, "that you are the only young lady I have encountered who understands the pleasure of contradiction." "And you are the only gentleman I have known," Elizabeth replied, "who flatters by implication rather than compliment. I must suppose you are determined to make me vain by a subtler method." "To make you vain would be superfluous. I merely admire the structure already in place." Elizabeth laughed, not displeased. "You see, Mr. Price, how easily you betray yourself. I begin to think you take more pleasure in cleverness than in kindness." "Ah, but cleverness is a kindness when practiced well. And I never mock those who cannot defend themselves." "That is very generous of you," she said, arching a brow. "But let us hope I never require such mercy." Though she said this lightly, it was not without pride. She felt, with some justification, that she had met in Mr. Price a worthy opponent, perhaps even an equal, and she reveled in the engagement. That he paid her particular attention was evident to all, though he never gave it in the manner of suitors. His flattery was disguised as sparring, and Elizabeth, who delighted in wit more than flirtation, responded with all the liveliness of her nature. Even Mary, whose notions of propriety were formed almost exclusively by Fordyce's sermons and the Sunday homily, was not immune to Mr. Price's appeal. "I believe he must be a most improving companion," she said solemnly one evening at dinner, after Mr. Price had left. "He quotes Johnson as easily as the Psalms, and I do not think he is of the theatre, though he understands plays." "Of course he understands plays," replied Lydia from the other end of the table. "He's from town, Mary. I dare say he has seen 100 actresses." This observation, while offered with Lydia's usual impertinence, was not entirely in jest. That Mr. Price had the air of London about him, refined, amused, just slightly weary, was part of his charm. In contrast to the gallant but predictable attentions of the Meryton officers, his presence lent the Bennet household a new animation. Mr. Bennet, for his part, regarded the growing rapport between his second daughter and their guest with a mixture of interest and mischief. "You are fencing with a borrowed sword, Lizzie," he remarked one afternoon, having overheard a particularly lively exchange. "Be careful not to run your wit through a man who knows the edge of his own." "I should hope, Papa," Elizabeth said with a smile, "that my wit is not so reckless as to offend its host." "Oh, I think he enjoys the danger. Just be certain he does not enjoy the game more than the opponent." Elizabeth was struck by this, but said nothing. Her father's counsel, though often cloaked in jest, seldom lacked penetration. It was Jane, however, who offered the gentlest and most lasting caution. "I like him," she said one evening as the two sisters read by the fire, "but I cannot yet decide if he is good." Elizabeth looked up. "Good? Yes. Cleverness is delightful, Lizzie. But I have seen you laugh more at others since he arrived." Elizabeth closed her book. "You think I am being unkind?" Jane hesitated, then shook her head. "No. Only I think it is easy to mistake amusement for wisdom, and you have always had more of the latter, even if you prefer to pretend otherwise." Elizabeth gave her a long look, touched and slightly unsettled. "You are too generous, Jane. You will make me quite serious if you continue." "Only serious enough," Jane said with a smile and returned to her page. But Elizabeth, for once, did not resume hers. In the week that followed, Elizabeth found herself drawn more frequently into conversation with Mr. Price, and more dangerously into imitation of his manner. What had begun as playful sparring grew gradually into sharper commentary, directed not only at ideas, but at persons, though never in their hearing, and always, Elizabeth thought, with a sense of justice. "Your cousin Mr. Collins must be a rich source of material," Mr. Price said one afternoon, as they walked the garden path bordered with late-blooming roses. "From all accounts, I believe he may be the only clergyman in England who mistakes his humility for a virtue others ought to admire." Elizabeth laughed. "You do him a kindness to presume he mistakes anything at all. I am not certain he is capable of the error." Mr. Price looked at her with delight. "You wound like a poet, Miss Bennet. elegant and precise. One fears to step too near you. One need not fear, she replied archly. Only flatter. This exchange, overheard by Jane from a little distance, gave her pause. That Elizabeth should jest was not unusual, but the edge of her humor had sharpened. It was not the tone that troubled Jane, it was the triumph in it. Later that evening, while folding linen together by candlelight, Jane spoke again, her tone gentle but firm. Lizzie, I have observed you laugh often this week, but less kindly. I wonder if you are as pleased with it as you seem. Elizabeth, still buoyed by the day's pleasantries, answered without much reflection. One may laugh kindly and still see folly where it lies. But where it lies is not always where we expect, Jane said. And sometimes, in laughing at others, we cease to look for our own faults. Elizabeth paused, then replied more soberly, Do you think I have been unjust? I think you are quick to see what is amiss in others, and sometimes that quickness may hide what is amiss in ourselves. Elizabeth, though struck, lifted her chin with a smile. You would have me as mild as yourself, Jane, but I cannot help it if I see what is ridiculous. It calls to me as naturally as it hides from you. To see it is one thing, Jane said softly. To scorn it is another. Elizabeth said no more, but her fingers, which had moved deftly over the linen moments before, now lingered in the folds. She did not relish censure, even when offered with such sweetness. Yet she could not help thinking herself unjustly checked. Had she not always prided herself on discernment? What harm could there be in laughing at absurdity when absurdity so plainly invited it? The next day her conviction seemed vindicated. As they passed through Meryton, Mr. Price pointed discreetly to a young lady struggling to contain a particularly recalcitrant bonnet feather, her mother trailing behind with an air of exasperation. "Observe, Miss Bennet," he said, lowering his voice. "The eternal conflict between fashion and nature. The feather longs to return to the sky, the young lady to the drawing-room, the mother to an earlier, less feathered age." Elizabeth laughed in spite of herself. "You are wicked, Mr. Price." "Only observant," he replied. "It is the world that supplies the material. I merely edit for clarity." She did not say it aloud, but in that moment she felt herself his equal. An editor, too, capable of cutting through the nonsense of society with wit as her pen. It was an intoxicating feeling. That Jane's words still echoed in her mind, faint and persistent. She would not admit, even to herself. As autumn advanced, the weather turned to a crispness that lent new pleasure to walking, and Elizabeth took frequent advantage of it. Mr. Price, with an unseasonable fondness for fresh air, was often her companion. Their conversations, once playful, had grown laced with irony and indulgent judgments of their neighbors' follies. Amusements Elizabeth had always allowed herself, but never with such confidence or audience. One afternoon, they encountered Miss Martha Long, a plain but earnest girl from Meryton with a voice like a pinched fiddle and a fondness for moral observations. She greeted them eagerly. "Oh, Miss Bennet, Mr. Price, have you heard? Mr. Denny is to give a reading of Cooper's The Task this Saturday. It is to be a most serious affair. No frivolities, I am told." "Indeed," replied Elizabeth, with a courteous smile. "Then I shall bring only my gravest bonnet." Miss Long did not comprehend the jest but nodded, reassured. "It is very proper of you to attend, Miss Bennet. Poetry, when solemn, improves the mind." "I agree," said Mr. Price, eyes twinkling. "Nothing improves the mind so much as sitting still and wishing to be elsewhere." Miss Long, still unoffended, curtsied and departed with a pleased expression, leaving the pair in stifled amusement. "Oh, Lizzie," Mr. Price said, once the path was clear, "do tell me how the good Miss Long came to mistake herself for a critic of poetry. One might as well ask a goose to lecture on the wind." Elizabeth laughed, but not quite so freely as before. Something in the remark struck her. Too sharp, too sure. "She means well," she offered, almost involuntarily. "And that is often the only defense of the tiresome," he replied, brushing a leaf from his coat. "But I shall not fault you for generosity. It becomes you." That evening, when Elizabeth recounted the incident over tea, her mimicry of Miss Long's strained earnestness brought hearty laughter from Lydia and Kitty and a reluctant smile from Mary. But Jane, seated quietly beside the fire, did not laugh. "You were very witty, Lizzie," she said, once the others had scattered. "But I wonder if Miss Long would laugh too." Elizabeth, still flushed from the company's delight, paused. "She need not hear it. But would you say it if she had?" Jane's eyes met hers, not accusing, but sorrowful. Elizabeth stood silent. Her mind, always quick to defend itself, searched for a retort, but found none she wished to voice. The next day, as she passed through Meryton alone, she encountered Miss Long again, this time in company with a group of young ladies. They curtsied politely, but there was a brief hesitation in Miss Long's greeting, a flicker of uncertainty. Elizabeth could not say whether she imagined it, but the impression lingered. Returning home, she found herself strangely subdued. Mr. Price was expected to call that afternoon, and when he did, he came armed with a new jest, some epigram drawn from a letter sent by his sister in town. But Elizabeth found her laughter slow to rise. "You are out of spirits," he observed, searching her face. "Is it possible the air of Hertfordshire has grown heavy?" "No," she replied slowly. "Only perhaps my thoughts." He looked at her, puzzled but unbothered, and offered a diversion in the form of a ridiculous anecdote involving a curate, a misdelivered ham, and a case of mistaken piety. Elizabeth smiled, but her mind remained elsewhere. That night, she stood at her window, watching the trees bend in the evening breeze. Jane's words returned to her, as did Miss Long's momentary pause, and the image of Mr. Price laughing, always laughing. "I wonder," she thought, "whether the habit of judging might become its own kind of blindness." She would not answer herself yet. It was not long before the subtle effects of Elizabeth's growing alignment with Mr. Price began to ripple through her most treasured relationships. Jane, though not of a temper to offer complaint, was no longer entirely at ease in her sister's company. There was a new reserve in Elizabeth's speech, a quickness to ridicule that, while never cruel, seemed less tempered by the compassion which had once distinguished her. One evening, as they sat together in the parlor, Jane broke the companionable silence. "Do you not think, Lizzie," she began cautiously, "that kindness, even when undeserved, is still a duty among friends?" Elizabeth, who had been rereading a letter from Charlotte Lucas and smirking over an unintentionally pompous line, glanced up. "Kindness, certainly. But must we always endure dullness with a smile? If a friend cannot bear the occasional prick of wit, perhaps she is more brittle than we supposed." Jane folded her hands gently in her lap. "But should it be our wit that provides the prick?" Elizabeth laughed, not unkindly. "Jane, you would make saints of us all, and then be surprised when the world turns away, hungry for entertainment. I grant that I may be a little sharper in humor of late, but it is not unprovoked. Have you never felt, even for a moment, that laughter is the surest defense against foolishness?" Jane gave her a look both fond and mournful. "I have felt it, Lizzie, but I have also seen how laughter, when made a weapon, can wound more deeply than we intend. And not every target knows they have been struck." Elizabeth felt the truth of this more than she wished to confess. She rose, unable to reply with ease, and crossed to the window where twilight had begun to settle over the hedgerows. The air outside was hushed, the last cry of a bird vanishing into dusk. Just then, Mr. Price arrived, announced with unusual alacrity by Hill, who had taken a quiet liking to the gentleman, though she declared him too fond of drawing-room talk to know the ways of a proper hearth. He entered with his usual energy, offering a bow more graceful than necessary and a remark about the coldness of the evening being well suited to warm conversation. "I trust you ladies are not too content," he said after the initial pleasantries. "For contentment, I find, is the surest enemy of insight." "Then you are safe indeed," Elizabeth replied with a half-smile. "There is no danger of complete contentment in Hertfordshire." Mr. Price laughed. "And yet here is Miss Bennet, glowing with tranquility. I begin to suspect her of inner mutiny." Jane only smiled in return, though it was a shade more reserved than usual. She excused herself soon after, pleading correspondence with their Aunt Gardiner. Left alone with Mr. Price, Elizabeth felt the shift in atmosphere. His attentions, never overt, seemed suddenly more deliberate. He leaned toward her as he spoke, his voice lowered, his gaze lingering. "You must forgive me," he said, "if I speak too freely, but I find myself increasingly drawn to the delight of your conversation. It is a rare thing to be understood, and rarer still to be challenged." Elizabeth felt a stirring of pride and hesitation. She had long prized the freedom of her mind, and here it was met with open admiration. Yet Jane's words still echoed. "Not every target knows they have been struck." "I value your regard, Mr. Price," she said carefully, "but I hope you admire not only the sharpness of my tongue." He smiled. "It is your judgment I admire, Miss Bennet, your ability to see what others miss. And if wit is the tool by which that sight is made bearable, then I admire that too." It was well said. It was too well said. Elizabeth, once thrilled by his praise, now found herself wondering what else he saw, and whether he wielded his wit as a tool or as a trap. When he departed, leaving behind the faint scent of tobacco and London polish, Elizabeth sat long by the fire, her book untouched. Had her judgment grown clearer, or merely more comfortable? She could not decide. The evening of the Meryton Assembly arrived with its usual mixture of provincial cheer and studied festivity. Though not the grandest affair, it was eagerly anticipated by the neighborhood, which took great pains to dress its ordinary spirits in ribbons and candlelight. Elizabeth, though accustomed to the modest pleasures of such gatherings, found herself less inclined to dance and more disposed to observe. Mr. Price, who had joined the party at the invitation of Sir William Lucas, was in high form. He moved among the company like a man rehearsing a part he had long since mastered, delighting in the folly of his audience without ever letting them suspect they were part of the performance. "Observe," he murmured to Elizabeth, as they stood near the refreshment table, "how Sir William bows as though every curtsy were a royal command. I begin to think he believes himself the pivot of the entire assembly." Elizabeth smothered a laugh. "He is, perhaps, the only man who can dance and condescend in the same step. And look there," he continued, lowering his voice further. "Miss Penelope Hart. She clutches her fan as though it were a moral shield. I dare say she believes modesty to be a visible accessory." "Or a weapon," Elizabeth replied. "If so, it is one she wields at every officer under 40. They laughed softly, but not unnoticed. Among those nearby was Charlotte Lucas, who had overheard enough to knit her brow. She turned away without a word, but not before Elizabeth caught the glance. Soon after, Mr. Price proposed that they observe the dancing from the side, where they might continue their private theater uninterrupted. Elizabeth, feeling herself admired and emboldened, agreed. It was during this retreat that Elizabeth, animated by a mix of attention and cleverness, made a remark that would linger far longer than she expected. Miss Hart, having approached the punch in the company of her younger cousin, was heard speaking of a recent sermon on virtue and female decorum, delivered with such gravity and eagerness that Mr. Price could not resist. "Tell me, Miss Bennet," he said sotto voce, "do you think virtue ever tires of being paraded about like a borrowed hat?" Elizabeth, without hesitation, replied, "Only when it finds itself on the wrong head." Mr. Price smiled broadly, too broadly. Others had turned. Among them was Miss Hart herself, who, having caught enough of the exchange to suspect its subject, turned pale and excused herself stiffly from her companion. Charlotte, standing not far behind, approached Elizabeth with an expression half pitying, half stern. "Lizzie," she said quietly, "I hope you do not suppose it a great triumph to humiliate a girl who has neither your cleverness nor your protection." Elizabeth colored. "Charlotte, I meant no harm. It was only a jest." "I believe you," Charlotte said gently, "but that does not mean it did no harm." She left before Elizabeth could reply. For the first time, Elizabeth did not look to Mr. Price for assurance. Instead, she stood silent, watching Miss Hart's retreating figure, shoulders stiff and head high. The music resumed, the conversation flowed as before, and no one seemed to mention what had passed. Yet the mood had shifted. The warmth Elizabeth once felt in such rooms now sat beside her like a too bright fire, glowing but discomforting. She turned to Mr. Price, but he was already engaged in amused conversation with the Lucases, entirely untroubled. That night, Elizabeth lay awake long after the candles had been extinguished. "It is nothing," she told herself. "I have only spoken the truth." But truth, she was beginning to learn, could bruise as much as it could illuminate, and in the mouth of the wrong speaker, it became indistinguishable from cruelty. The days following the Meryton assembly passed with a stillness that Elizabeth found disconcerting. Nothing outwardly had changed, yet everything felt altered. Miss Hart, though still present in company, now greeted Elizabeth with a civility so measured that it left no room for warmth. The other young ladies, those who had once gathered near Elizabeth for her clever remarks, now lingered a little longer before approaching, their eyes searching hers for irony even in the mildest question. It was Jane who, in her quiet way, confirmed what Elizabeth had already begun to suspect. "Lizzie," she said one morning as they walked a shaded path behind Longbourn, "I must speak plainly. I fear that some of our neighbors have misunderstood you." Elizabeth, determined not to appear wounded, replied with studied indifference. "Then they are more easily confused than I thought." Jane hesitated. Not confused, perhaps, only cautious. It is not every young lady who can laugh so freely and escape notice. "Must we then all speak with solemnity to be considered respectable?" Elizabeth asked. "I had not thought with such a danger." "It is not the wit, Lizzie," Jane said gently. "It is the intention behind it, and whether it leaves others better or worse." Elizabeth bit her lip. "I had no intention of cruelty. Miss Hart parades her virtue as if it were stitched into her gown. Am I to pretend blindness?" "No," said Jane with quiet conviction. "But neither must we mistake perception for license. I know you meant no harm, but not everyone has your strength to bear scrutiny, especially when that scrutiny is offered with laughter." Elizabeth felt these words more deeply than she let on. That evening, as she sat in the drawing-room with her needlework untouched and Mr. Price's recent letter folded unread upon the table, her thoughts returned to the assembly. She had seen Miss Hart there, not truly seen her, but weighed and dismissed her, as one might a dull book too prettily bound. And yet Miss Hart, with her uncertain smile and tremulous opinions, had spoken from sincerity. Elizabeth, for all her discernment, had replied with show. The next day brought further signs of quiet estrangement. When Elizabeth entered the milliner's shop in Meryton, Mrs. Langley, the shopkeeper, offered her a courteous nod, but her conversation was stilted, and she made no effort to draw Elizabeth into the usual gossip. Later, upon meeting Charlotte Lucas by chance on the lane to Lucas Lodge, Elizabeth attempted a warm greeting. "Charlotte, I had hoped we might walk together." Charlotte smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. "I am expected indoors," she said. "Another time, perhaps." "Are you well?" Elizabeth asked, trying to recover the ease they once shared. "Well enough," said Charlotte, and added with a touch of sorrow. "But sometimes wit is a finer cloak than feeling, Lizzie. You wear it better than most, but not always without cost." She walked on, leaving Elizabeth to stand alone on the path, the wind stirring the hem of her gown like a whispered reproach. That evening Mr. Price called again. His humor was as sharp as ever, and he seemed unaware, perhaps unconcerned, by the slight coolness of Elizabeth's reception. "You seem subdued," he said as they stood by the window. "Surely Hertfordshire has not exhausted its stores of absurdity." "No," Elizabeth said after a moment. "Only mine of patience." He laughed. "Well spoken. When the world grows tiresome, it is best to mock it. That is the only remedy available to the intelligent." She looked at him then, not as she had before with admiration or shared amusement, but with a faint trace of doubt. "I am no longer certain that mockery is the same as insight," she said, "or that it remedies anything at all." Mr. Price raised a brow, amused. "Miss Bennet, if you will not laugh with me, You may soon find yourself laughing at yourself, which is the loneliest kind of jest. Elizabeth turned away from the window. She could not answer him. The first flickers of shame had begun to take root, and with them, the slow, unwelcome light of self-examination. The following Tuesday brought an invitation from the Lucases, who were determined to fill their drawing room with music, cards, and a few clever minds to lift the tone. As Sir William declared with pompous satisfaction, Mr. Price, of course, was counted among that number, and Elizabeth, though less eager than usual, accepted. Upon arrival, she noted that Charlotte was cool but not unfriendly. A quiet civility had replaced their former intimacy, and Elizabeth, keenly aware of it, felt its absence more than she expected. The company was small and respectable. Lady Lucas and her younger children, Mr. and Mrs. Long, a cousin or two of the Lucases from London, and of course Mr. Price, who was already established at the hearth, engaged in clever repartee with the younger Miss Lucas. "I do believe," he was saying with a smile, "that the true sign of gentility is never to be surprised by one's own wit, or shamed by another's want of it." This was met with laughter, though not from everyone. Elizabeth took her seat quietly and observed. She was struck by how different his tone became when surrounded by an admiring audience. His words, once shared with her in quiet confidence, now appeared preened for effect, carefully balanced between irony and exhibition. He delivered opinions not to explore them but to perform them. When Charlotte brought out the chessboard, Mr. Price offered a flourish of his hand. "Ah, chess. The only game fit for those with minds too restless for whist and too impatient for patience." Elizabeth, seated beside him, remarked lightly, "Yet even the most strategic players may overlook a pawn, if they are too fond of the knight's theatrics." There was a slight pause, brief but telling. Mr. Price smiled, but his eyes sharpened. "Surely, Miss Bennet, no piece is more theatrical than the Queen, who moves boldly in all directions and expects no less than awe from her opponent." Charlotte, who had taken her place at the board, cleared her throat softly. "Or perhaps, Mr. Price, it is not the piece but the player who seeks awe." Elizabeth looked at her friend and smiled faintly. For the first time in weeks, she felt the flicker of shared understanding return between them. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth's attention shifted. She listened to Mr. Price speak on poetry and society, on manners and mediocrity, all with equal ease, but also with a kind of detachment that left no room for earnestness. He admired nothing too openly, praised nothing without a condition, and dismissed much with charming disdain. She recalled Jane's words, "Not every target knows they have been struck." And now Elizabeth saw the marks Mr. Price left behind, not on his subjects, who laughed and clapped and admired, but on the sincerity that shrank in his presence. When the guests began to depart, Charlotte walked with Elizabeth to the doorway, under the pretense of fetching a shawl. "I suppose Mr. Price is much admired," Charlotte said, not looking at her. Elizabeth hesitated. "Admiration," she replied slowly, "can sometimes be confused with fascination." Charlotte met her gaze then, and the distance between them softened. "Then I hope you never confuse either with affection," she said. Elizabeth nodded, too moved to reply. As she stepped into the night air, cool and sharp with frost, Elizabeth pulled her cloak closer. Mr. Price offered his arm to walk her to the carriage, and she took it with polite thanks, but no longer with ease. "Miss Bennet," he said as they approached the gate, "I hope you will not think me vain if I admit that I find our conversations singularly bracing." Elizabeth turned to him, her tone measured. "Mr. Price, I think you are quite content to be singular, whether or not you are bracing." He looked at her sharply but only laughed. "You wound me, Miss Bennet. Then I fear I have learned from the best." She climbed into the carriage without waiting for a reply. As the horses pulled away, Elizabeth sat back in her seat, her thoughts as restless as the wind outside. She had once thought Mr. Price the herald of clarity, a sharper mirror to her mind. But now that mirror reflected not discernment but performance. And for the first time, she questioned whether judgment without kindness was anything more than vanity in finer dress. In the days that followed the gathering at Lucas Lodge, Elizabeth Bennet found her thoughts increasingly withdrawn from the easy pleasure of society. Not for want of invitations, for Hertfordshire continued to bustle with its accustomed frequency of dinners and card tables, but from a restlessness in her own mind, which refused the diversions that once charmed her. Her growing unease with Mr. Price had not found form in a single declaration, nor had it prompted any quarrel. Rather, it manifested in a deliberate coolness, a measured distance that only she could trace. When next Mr. Price called at Longbourn, she contrived to be absent. When he sent a note, brief, light, and elusive, she replied with politeness and no more. When she did see him in town, she returned his bow with composure, but did not cross the street. Jane, ever observant, noticed the change. "You no longer speak of Mr. Price?" she remarked one morning, as they walked among the brown hedgerows lining the road to Meryton. "There is little to say," Elizabeth replied. "When a person has said too much already." Jane gave her a sideways look. "I hope nothing has occurred to cause offense." "No, not offense," said Elizabeth thoughtfully. "Only a shift in clarity. I once thought him a friend to reason, but I find he is merely a friend to irony." "And is there such a difference?" "A great one, I think. Reason may teach, but irony only exposes. The one leads forward, the other pulls away." Jane nodded, pleased with her sister's return to reflection. "Then you are wiser now than you were a month ago." Elizabeth smiled. "Wiser, perhaps, but not lighter of heart." They walked on in companionable silence. The lane opened upon the market square, where the usual throng of tradesmen and ladies in bonnets wove between carts and booths. Elizabeth saw Miss Hart across the way, speaking to Mrs. Long. Though she had every reason to pass by, Elizabeth hesitated. "I will be only a moment," she said, and crossed the square. Miss Hart turned, startled. "Miss Bennet." Elizabeth inclined her head. "Miss Hart, I hope I do not interrupt." "No, not at all," she said with some stiffness, though her eyes were wary. "I wish to say," Elizabeth began, then paused, collecting herself, "that I regret, truly regret, if any words of mine at the assembly gave offense. Wit may amuse, but it ought not to wound." Miss Hart blinked, uncertain. "I do not seek apology, Miss Bennet," she said at last. "Only less notice." Elizabeth smiled sadly. "Then you shall have it. And, I hope, peace as well." She curtsied gently and turned back toward Jane, who watched her with quiet approval. Later that evening, Elizabeth sat at her writing desk, quill in hand, a sheet of cream paper before her. She considered writing to Mr. Price, not to offer rebuke, but to explain her retreat from their acquaintance. Yet after a moment's thought, she folded the page and returned the quill to its rest. What was there to say to a man who listened only to echo? She opened instead a volume of Cooper's poems, and found comfort in their unassuming wisdom. "Knowledge is proud that he has learnt so much. Wisdom is humble that he knows no more." She read the line again and smiled, not with triumph, but with something quieter, understanding. For the first time in weeks, her heart was at ease, not because she had judged rightly, but because she had judged kindly. The fortnight following Elizabeth's quiet reckoning passed not in isolation, but in a gradual rejoining of society, marked by subtler tones of conversation and a softening in her conduct that those who had once admired her wit now came to value more deeply. Her relations with Charlotte, once strained beneath the weight of unsaid disapproval, began to heal by degrees. A walk resumed here, a letter answered there, until at last, their shared affection, though less effusive than before, was once again unforced. "I am glad," Charlotte said one afternoon as they strolled near the spinney behind Lucas Lodge, "that we speak freely again." "As am I," Elizabeth replied with genuine warmth. "I had not realized how much I prized our companionship until I endangered it by mistaking cleverness for truth." Charlotte smiled. "You never lack truth, Lizzie. Only sometimes the gentler kind." "Then I hope I am learning it," Elizabeth said, "though I suspect it is not taught by the same masters as wit." That evening at Longbourn, her father, who had said little of Mr. Price throughout his visits and departure, finally spoke on the subject as they sat together in the bookroom. "I take it our friend Mr. Price has lost his appeal?" he inquired, glancing over his spectacles. Elizabeth turned a page of her book, then looked up. "He remains entertaining, Papa, but no longer essential." Mr. Bennet chuckled. "Then you have judged him wisely, my dear, though I shall miss his polished disdain for the common herd. It made the evenings less dull." "I fear his disdain extends too far to spare even his admirers," Elizabeth replied. "Admiration is a poor bargain if purchased at the expense of others." "Ah," said Mr. Bennet with mock solemnity, "you grow profound. I shall be forced to revise my will in favor of Mary." "Do not alarm yourself," Elizabeth said, laughing. "I remain your daughter, and not without my impertinence." But though her humor endured, its expression had softened. At a dinner held by the Gouldings the following week, Elizabeth was seated beside Mr. Mortimer, a shy, stooping gentleman of few words and less confidence. In times past, she might have made sport of his silences or provoked his awkwardness for amusement. But now she listened with real patience as he spoke hesitantly of parish matters and the state of the roads. When he mentioned his fondness for cultivating roses, Elizabeth's eyes lit up. "My sister Jane loves roses. Do you find the white bloom more difficult to maintain?" He nodded, pleased to be heard. "It requires more care than most suspect. Too much sun, and it wilts, but too little and it sours." "Much like character," Elizabeth said gently. "A delicate balance between warmth and reserve." Mr. Mortimer blinked, then smiled. Perhaps the first true smile he had shown all evening. Across the table, Miss Hart observed Elizabeth's attentiveness with cautious surprise. Later, as the guests gathered their shawls and gloves to depart, she approached Elizabeth with evident hesitation. "Miss Bennet," she said, "I had not thought to find a friend in you." Elizabeth looked at her warmly. "Then I am glad to have disappointed your expectations." Miss Hart smiled, a shy, uncertain thing but real. And so it was that Elizabeth, once the sharpest tongue in any room, began to gain a different reputation, one of discernment not merely in thought, but in heart. She did not abandon her wit, for that would have been dishonest to her nature. But now it was no longer armor nor spectacle, but rather a companion to her growing understanding. As Jane said to her one morning over tea, "You are not changed, Lizzie, only refined." Elizabeth laughed. "Then let me not be too polished. I should not like to become dull." "You could never be dull," Jane said affectionately. "Only kinder, and that is never in excess." It was on a gray morning, softened by drizzle and the quiet ticking of the long case clock in the front hall, that the letter arrived. Hill, ever discreet, placed it on the breakfast table beside Elizabeth's teacup with a murmured, "From town, miss." Elizabeth recognized the handwriting at once. Elegant, slanted, and confident. "Mr. Price." She turned it over once, twice, then slowly broke the seal. "My dear Miss Bennet, you have been much missed. The parlors of Hertfordshire are poorer for your absence, and I must presume some higher calling has drawn your attentions from society. For no lesser reason could excuse the sudden silence of a mind so spirited. I flatter myself that we once spoke the same language, though perhaps I spoke it too fluently for your liking. I confess myself surprised by your withdrawal. Have I offended, or merely ceased to amuse? In either case, I hope the fault is not irredeemable. I remain, with as much esteem as mischief allows, yours in elusive camaraderie, B. Price. Elizabeth read the letter twice and, though the words were mild and urbane, she felt a curious mixture of sorrow and release. There had been a time mere weeks ago when such a letter would have thrown her into delightful confusion, when his irony would have been read as affection and his mischief as intimacy. Now she read it plainly. She passed the letter across the table to Jane, who received it with her usual quiet grace. "Well?" her sister asked after reading. "He has written a riddle and expects me to believe it is an apology," Elizabeth replied. Jane gave a soft laugh. "What will you write in return?" "Nothing," said Elizabeth, stirring her tea. "A silence is sometimes the kindest answer to an echo." Jane said nothing more, but reached out to squeeze her hand. Later that day, Elizabeth walked out alone. The air had turned brisk, the sky pale and dappled with reluctant sunlight. The fields beyond Longbourn wore the russet brown of late autumn, and the wind tugged gently at her shawl. Her thoughts turned, not to Mr. Price, but to herself, her former pride and judgment, her easy dismissal of others, the wounds she had inflicted with the excuse of honesty. There had been, she now saw, a certain selfish delight in being thought the cleverest person in the room. And what had that cleverness earned her? A friend lost for a time, a suitor who had only admired his own reflection in her, a reputation that, once sharp and admirable, had begun to cast a chill on those who knew her. And yet, there was no bitterness in the reflection, only a quiet resolve. "I have mistaken acuteness for clarity," she said aloud, "and clarity for wisdom. But true judgment must do more than see. It must understand." As she reached the crest of the lane, the spire of Meryton Church rose in the distance, modest and dignified. Its bell rang faintly, marking the hour. She paused there, letting the sound wash over her. She had not written to Mr. Price, and would not. Some farewells, she now knew, needed no formality, only closure within oneself. She turned back toward Longbourn, a calmness settling over her like the waning light. Her wit remained, but she felt no urgency to wield it. For the first time, she felt no need to prove herself clever. It was enough to be thoughtful, to be fair, to be kind. And in that quiet recognition, she saw herself more clearly than ever before. As autumn ripened into winter and the hedgerows took on their barren, sculpted beauty, Elizabeth found herself once more among the familiar rhythms of Longbourn. The bustle of morning callers, the creak of the drawing-room floorboards, the endless speculations of her mother on advantageous marriages. Yet something had changed. The rooms she had once filled with laughter now welcomed her calm. The sharpness of her remarks, once so eagerly awaited, gave way to something more measured, no less spirited, but less inclined to wound. One afternoon, Charlotte came again to visit. The fire burned low as they sat together with their workboxes, the quiet filled with the gentle rasp of needle through cloth and the occasional crackle of the hearth. "I had a letter from Mr. Price," Charlotte said at length. "He is returned to town." Elizabeth looked up, unsurprised, and no doubt already engaged in sketching the follies of his next circle. Charlotte smiled faintly. "You did not regret him?" "I regret only that I once mistook his cleverness for character." Charlotte nodded. "And do you fear being mistaken again?" Elizabeth considered this. "No, for I have learnt the difference between judgment that flatters and judgment that serves. The one delights in superiority, the other humbles and guides." "You speak very wisely, Lizzie." "I speak, I hope, from understanding, which is a rarer thing." Later that week, Mr. Bennet observed his daughter in conversation with Mr. Mortimer, who now visited with greater frequency, if still great shyness. He watched as Elizabeth drew him out gently on matters of botany and scripture, never laughing at his awkwardness, only encouraging his sincerity. When Mr. Mortimer departed, Mr. Bennet turned to her with one brow arched. "You appear to have exchanged flint for velvet." Elizabeth laughed. "Do you disapprove, Papa?" "On the contrary, velvet cuts more quietly, but wears longer." Elizabeth curtsied in mock gratitude. "Then I may yet prove durable." But perhaps the truest affirmation came one Sunday after service, as the congregation milled before the porch. Miss Hart, standing beside her aunt, made her way to Elizabeth with a hesitant grace. "Miss Bennet," she began, "I hope you will not think me bold, but I wish to thank you." Elizabeth tilted her head. "For what?" "For not laughing. For speaking to me, though you had no need." Elizabeth's voice was warm. "We all have need, Miss Hart. The only question is whether we know it." The girl flushed, but her smile was steady. As the crowd dispersed, Elizabeth walked with Jane back toward Longbourn. The road was rutted and familiar, the trees bare but noble. "Do you think," Elizabeth asked softly, "that we may become more ourselves by choosing to be less?" Jane looked at her fondly. "If you mean humbler, Lizzie, Then yes, I believe that very much. Elizabeth smiled and took her sister's arm. No triumph attended her now, no conquest won, no suitor gained or admirer reclaimed. And yet, she felt richer than she had at the height of her cleverest days, for she had learnt, at last, that the finest judgments are not made aloud, but in the quiet refinement of one's own heart. And thus ended Elizabeth's early lesson. Not in pride, nor in prejudice, but in something more lasting. The power to see truly, speak kindly, and choose wisely. Thank you for joining us on this journey into Elizabeth Bennet's untold past. If this story stirred your love for Jane Austen, character-driven tales, or thoughtful storytelling, we invite you to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts below. Would young Elizabeth have impressed you even then? And stay tuned for more literary stories that bring classic characters to life in new and meaningful ways.